I always like to end on a positive note, so here is a rousing, uplifting song which is guaranteed to cheer you up. When you attend a funeral, it is sad to think that sooner or later those you love will do the same for you. And you may have thought it tragic, not to mention other adjectives, to think of all the weeping they will do. But don't you worry, no more ashes, no more sackcloth, and an armband made of black cloth will someday nevermore adorn a sleeve. For if the bomb that drops on you gets your friends and neighbors too, there'll be nobody left behind to grieve, and we will all go together when we go. What a comforting fact that is to know. Universal bereavement, an inspiring achievement. Yes, we all will go together when we go.
Happy New Year. Happy 2020. It is January. I thought we would start off on a cheerful note with a musical introduction, but it is the time of year for New Year's resolutions. My resolution is to stop arguing about politics with family members, but your resolution for January and February in Lincoln Douglas is resolved. States ought to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. If you are new to the channel, Hail State Debate is all about just helping LD debaters across the country and PF debaters as well just be the best that they can be, whether you're in a big program, a small program, no program, you're out there debating by yourself. That's what we're about. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. Those of you returning may have noticed we're not in our brand new studio today because even though I have a lot of help getting these videos out, I am actually the only one on campus during the winter break. So it's just me, so I didn't think it was worth opening up the studio for that. So on these two videos this month, it will just be me here in the office. As always, we want this to be useful to you, so if it is, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. You can also consider following us on Twitter at Hail State Debate for general thoughts on debate and resolutions and stuff like that. As always, we will put the links and the timestamps in the description below, so if you're looking for something we cite, there will be a lot of them on this. This is a jam-packed, chock-full topic. About the topic, I will say I wasn't crazy about it at the beginning, but I am warming up to it. I think there are a lot more angles than I initially thought. I think it's going to be a good resolution. I think you guys are going to enjoy it. Obviously, there's a lot of big tournaments coming up in January and February, not just if you're out there on the national circuit getting ready for TOC, but at the state level, the regional level, qualifying tournaments for NSDA, or if you go to NCFL, some of those are going to start ramping up, so some of those will be in there. So there's a lot of reasons to work hard on this topic. I have a few initial thoughts. Let me just lay them out, and then we'll move on to talking about definitions, framework, and things like that. First thought on this topic is, as is usually the case with me, I think this is a topic where you're going to have to be able to have a coherent story that you can tell to most judges, right? It's a topic where it's not impossible, but it is difficult to just purely overwhelm people with empirics and evidence and cards and things like that. You have to have logic and clear explanations. Now, to be fair, we actually worked really hard on researching this thing, and we went out and found what I think are some pretty good empirical studies and evidence and things about, like, for example, how many lives would be lost in a nuclear exchange, right? What the probability and the statistical likelihood of nuclear exchanges are, how well deterrence works or doesn't work. And I think there's a lot of good empirics on both sides. But for your typical judge, you're still going to have to be able to lay out a basic story. On the app, that story is going to be the existential risk of nuclear weapons, the massive death, the possibility of extinction, the fact that even a tiny, seemingly manageable risk multiplied by billions of people and extrapolated over decades and centuries is unacceptable. It's about how nuclear deterrence just means that we're committing to keep the peace by basically agreeing that we're willing to murder millions or billions of innocent people. And it's also about telling the story about how there's a realistic way to achieve nuclear deterrence. It's not just some pie in the sky imaginary goal that you know, sort of peaceniks out there talk about. It's something that really can be done, and there are real plans for it. On the negative, your story is basically, look, nuclear weapons exist. We can't uninvent them. We can't put the nuclear genie back in the bottle. But in the status quo, quo, the good news is these weapons actually provide a powerful deterrent, not just for nuclear war, but for all forms of war. They've made the world a less violent place over the last 70 years. But if we, as the good guys, or the people, the responsible people who would actually listen to a resolution like this, if they give up their nuclear weapons, that's just going to give the bad guys a monopoly on nuclear force, which will make the world a more dangerous place. Plus, we also have good alternatives like no first use policies. Anyway, that's the kind of basic storytelling you're going to be looking at on the topic. So just kind of get yourself in that frame of mind as we go through the video. A few other quick thoughts. Number two thought is this is an evergreen topic, so don't be afraid to use older sources. Some of the brightest minds in the world in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s were thinking about nuclear war, thinking about deterrence, thinking about disarmament. Don't eschew those sources. Don't reject them just because they're a little bit older. Some of the smartest folks around were looking at them. If you see a Kenneth Waltz source from 1978 or a Morton Kaplan source from 1958 on like nuclear game theory, those are going to be some of the best things written. And the calculus really hasn't changed all that much, right? Yes, Russia and the United States have reduced their stockpiles, but they still have enough to destroy the world many times over. So the fundamental calculus isn't different. These are still good articles. I would certainly make them a part of your reading and maybe a part of your case. Also, be mindful of the weight on this topic. I know that we talk about nuclear weapons in Lincoln-Douglas debate on other topics where maybe they frankly don't belong, you know, at least not in the real world conversation about how nuclear war is an impact. And we might get a little glib talking about nukes and things like that, and maybe even make a little joke. There was a little humor in the introduction that we just did. But remember, the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are real. You want to treat them with respect, even though they happened a long time ago. You know, we're going to show you a link to a video from Kurskazak, for example, which is a great site that shows exactly what it's like to experience a nuclear attack on a city. And I think you'll see just kind of how horrific that would be. So be respectful of it. And then lastly, I don't usually do this in the introduction, but there's a mandatory source I want to point out to you guys. This is from the Carnegie Endowment. It's called Abolishing Nuclear Weapons, a Debate. It's from 2009, so it's a decade old, but still fairly recent in the context of this kind of a debate. And it is really just your one-stop shop for amazing information. It is just 350 pages of some of the best scholars on nuclear disarmament and deterrence, debating the generalities, the specifics, the particulars. Honestly, you could turn this video off and go read that, and you would be very well prepared for the topic, right? Now, you can do both, okay? So just, you know, watch the video, but it is fantastic. And if you just download this thing and start reading, you're going to be at a huge advantage. It's just that good. I don't usually cite things at the top of the video, but I wanted to put that out there for you so that if you're just clicking here, you do see it. So with that, we're going to jump right into it. We're first going to do a very quick survey of the history of nuclear weapons. Second, we'll talk about framework and definitions, values and criteria, and then the AF and the neg. And if you can't tell, yes, we are going fast. Sorry about that, but you know, you guys are debaters. You're used to it. There's a lot to get in here, so we will start with a quick history survey right now. Okay, so really quickly on the history of nuclear weapons, as with any topic, you're going to want to make sure that you have some basic literacy and understanding of sort of the general background information, right? If you just go into rounds with only the quotes and only the stats and only the stuff in your case and maybe a few blocks, yes, you might beat average debaters or okay debaters, but against good debaters, you're going to get really rolled. Knowing the general history and having the literacy makes you more agile. It makes you have more diversity of arguments, better able to respond to different things. Now, there's no time in a video like this for us to spend 30 minutes going through the entire history of nuclear development and proliferation and things along those lines. So what we're instead going to do is, number one, I'm going to link to a couple of articles and maybe some videos. I haven't really decided yet that will hopefully do a better job than I could kind of explaining the general history. Make sure you take some time to become familiar with those. But what I'm also going to do right now is just give you kind of a general checklist of some basic concepts you want to make sure that you're familiar with, right? So just starting from the very beginning, you want to know about the development of nuclear weapons in World War II by the United States, Los Alamos, just the basics of that. You obviously want to know the two times in history where they were actually used in combat of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the debates about whether those attacks were necessary to end World War II or were they overkill, could they have been used on non-populated areas, things like that. You obviously spend some time learning about the Cold War buildup of nuclear weapons, right? This includes things like the Cuban Missile Crisis. This includes the general building up of nuclear arsenals in the United States and in Russia primarily, right? Know how big the stockpiles got. I think in the United States, peak size for our arsenal in 1967 was something like 31,200 warheads compared to like something in the neighborhood of 6,000 today. So you see there was this massive paranoia and this massive expansion of nuclear arsenals to the point that they could destroy the world many times over. Understand different types of nuclear weapons. This is really essential. The bombs that would be used today in a nuclear war are not the same as those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The biggest ones, many of them, are orders of magnitude more powerful. They're called hydrogen bombs. They use a form of nuclear fusion as opposed to simple fission, which is what you saw in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, and you need to understand they're more powerful. Also, there are smaller varieties of nuclear weapons, things called tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons, and this may provide an angle for the negative. These are things that would be deployed not against the city, not indiscriminately against people, but for example against like an enemy submarine, an enemy bunker, things along those lines. Could the negative potentially argue that we keep those, right? Well, they are growing as parts of the United States and Russia's arsenal. So there's a debate about whether they are, on the one hand, something that maybe the negative can cite that we keep, or on the other hand, the affirmative might say they're like a gateway drug that would make us more likely to use larger nuclear weapons. But be familiar with them, right? Understand who the nuclear states are, you know, the US, Russia, the UK, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. Israel, obviously, it does not openly admit to having nuclear weapons, but it's kind of an open secret. They like people to believe it, and they almost certainly do, right? Understand that in the past, we have seen states give up their nuclear programs. South Africa in the 1990s had a small number of nuclear weapons and voluntarily and verifiably got rid of them, right? Understand what the total arsenal is in the world. There are about 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world. The United States and Russia have about 14,000 of those. All of the rest have a much, much smaller number. Understand the ways in which they're delivered. ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, but there's also, for example, submarine-based missiles. There are, nuclear weapons that can be delivered in something as small as a briefcase, right? That's not traditionally part of a national arsenal, but all of those things are possible. The United States has something called a nuclear triad, which is 3 different ways of delivering nuclear weapons to ensure that no matter what happens, we can always hit back at our opponents, right? And then lastly, take some time to understand exactly how lethal nuclear weapons are. Read some of the scenarios about exactly how many people they could kill and how they would go about doing that. There are some really good articles that explain that the vast majority of people that would die in a nuclear war would not die as a result of the blast. That would kill millions, maybe even billions, but the vast majority of folks would die due to things like changing the climate through nuclear winter, through cancer like radiation, through the destruction of infrastructure, the destruction of agriculture, the destruction of medical care. Most of the scenarios that talk about deaths in a major nuclear exchange talk about things like environmental degradation, starvation, radiation, things along those lines. So be familiar with how that works, and be familiar with the evidence and the debate about whether that could actually plausibly lead to human extinction, because there is a debate about that. I wish I had more time to go over all these things, but unfortunately in an hour plus video, there's just no way. But take the time to look in the links and make yourself familiar with these things, because again, you will sound smarter, you will be more agile, you will have more diversity in responding to arguments, and it'll just be a better, more fun topic for you. So with that, let's move on and talk a little bit about framework and definitions. Okay, so on definitions and framework, let's start with some general framing questions and move on to the specific definitions. So first of all, on general framing, I think one of the most important questions is exactly what does voting AF get you? What happens in the affirmative world as a practical matter? This matters a lot when it comes to things like deterrence, right? So let me just back up and give a little bit of framework and explain what I mean, and hopefully you'll see why this is important. So nuclear weapons are obviously unique because they're so destructive that they make it like impossible to win a war. We have this idea of 2 nuclear states have this thing called mutually assured destruction, or MAD, like that's the appropriate acronym, right? And the idea is that even if you win the war, you're going to basically be annihilated or devastated so badly that it just doesn't make sense to fight a nuclear war. And this is the real world reason why we have a debate or a disagreement about nuclear disarmament. It's not that anybody thinks that nuclear weapons are like intrinsically good or beneficial. It's that the other side has them, the bad guys have them, whoever we think the bad guys are. Therefore, we have to have them to deter them, and that leads to a stalemate, that leads to stability where they don't get used. In other words, they're a bad thing, but they're a bad thing that is going to exist. Therefore, we need to have them to prevent them from being used, either actually used or used as a leverage to bully people, right? And this has, to some extent, been successful. There's this idea called nuclear peace theory that we'll talk about later on the negative, that we haven't seen major power wars, right, in the last 70 years since the invention of nuclear weapons. But here's the question, okay, and this is important. If the resolution says resolve, states ought to eliminate their nuclear weapons, does that mean that by voting aft, you basically make all state-owned nuclear weapons disappear forever? Because if that's what it means, right, aren't you effectively sort of fiating, like using the judge fiat power to totally get rid of the nuclear deterrence argument? If all state-owned nuclear weapons are gone, then effectively there's no longer anything to deter. The whole argument in the real world that these are a necessary evil because some people will always have them is going to be gotten rid of. It can't realistically be gotten rid of in the real world, at least that's what the neg would argue, but you as the judge are just like waving your magic wand and making it go away. And there are more specific ways you can ask this question. Does the affirmative ballot mean that all states eliminate nuclear weapons or just some? Can other states like Iran, who don't have nuclear weapons, still pursue them in the affirmative world, or is that barred by an affirmative ballot? If you vote affirmative, do all of these nuclear weapons somehow disappear forever, or is there a chance that they could come back, right? If we affirm, but world war breaks out 20 years from now, right? Is it possible for these countries to bring back their nuclear arsenals? In the real world, they almost certainly would. Does the affirmative ballot prevent them from doing that? These are important framing theoretical questions you have to ask, because obviously, if the affirmative can just magically get rid of all nuclear weapons, they're taking away the idea of nuclear deterrence. Maybe not conventional deterrence, but nuclear deterrence, which is a huge part of the real world case for not eliminating all nuclear weapons. The negative, of course, is going to want to argue that no, you can't do that. Even if you establish some kind of general obligation, like for example, under the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which we'll talk about, or under the Global Zero proposal, which we will also talk about, even if you do those things, there are going to be bad actors. There are going to be North Koreas, maybe Russias of the world who don't follow along with it. They will keep nuclear weapons, and that will create a situation where there's more risk. And the neg will say, it's only fair that I be able to point out that that's what will happen in the real world. You can't just magically get rid of it. Anyway, I hope that sort of general, it's almost kind of like a debate theory point, is clear, right? If the negative is not pushing back and saying, no, nuclear weapons cannot be uninvented, they will exist even in the affirmative world, you're just taking them out of the hands of the good guys, then you're going to be conceding a lot of strategic ground. And if the AF can win that, then you're going to be gaining a lot of strategic ground. And we'll talk more about how to argue that in just a second on the definitions, but I just wanted you to be aware of the fact that it is, I think, a very important theoretical question. Two more smaller framework issues. First of all, there's time frame. I don't think there's any reason why the affirmative cannot insist on or ask for a reasonable time frame. If you look, for example, to real world proposals like Global Zero, they're talking about like a 25-year time frame to gradually scale down nuclear weapons and then verify that they're gone. I don't think there's any plausible way to sort of make it happen like that, right? So I don't think there's any problem with a reasonable time frame if you want to run that in your affirmative to avoid some of the, shock of trying to do it all at once. And then lastly, just from a framing perspective, specific plans and advocacies versus general like moral cases, like traditional LD cases. I think you can do it either way. As we're going to see in a minute, there are some good options for the AF to run like specific advocacies like proposed treaties and interest group proposals. There is also a strong option of just saying we're talking about a general moral obligation that all countries have. And as we'll see as well, there are options about whether you want to run a general advocacy for all countries or just run one that's limited to a couple. I actually think that's a little more dubious, as we'll talk about in a minute. I think the definition of states means that it is more difficult to justify running a limited case to just a few countries, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. So anyway, those are sort of the general framing issues. Now let's talk a little bit about definitions. Okay, so to get us started with the definitions, we're going to have my favorite fifth grader, Olivia. Olivia, come on out. She's been very patient while we shot the video, so she's going to help us out. Olivia, starting out with the term in the resolution states, what do you think we're talking about when we say states? Is it like states like New York and California, or what?
No, I think it's like countries, the nation states.
Okay, fair enough. And like, why do you think that?
Well, because if it were the other way around, it wouldn't make sense. For example, Alabama doesn't have nuclear weapons.
That's right, and it's a good thing too. All right, thanks very much, Olivia. Appreciate it. We'll see you next time. Now, additionally on states, there's an even more important question than the one Olivia talked about, which is how many states are we talking about and which ones, right? When we say states with no qualifier next to it, do we mean all states? Does the affirmative have to affirm and point to all states? Or are they talking about maybe states in general, but perhaps with some exceptions? Or are they talking about, 2 or more states, which is what I've heard some people argue. This is highly relevant to the argument I talked about just a second ago, which is, does voting affirmative get rid of all nuclear weapons for all states, right? And I think the affirmative can make use of an argument we've talked about before, which is the idea of a bare plural, right? Now, we've talked about this before on the channel, but let me go through it, right? The idea of a bare plural is that when we see a noun like states, that is plural, without a modifier, a quantifier like some, all, or most, right? The natural way we interpret that in most cases, there are definitely exceptions, but in most cases is to interpret it as a categorical or general rule that applies to the entire category. This is especially true when we look at the use of bare plural nouns in normative or rule-based statements like a debate resolution. So for example, if we see a rule that says motorists should drive under the speed limit, no one interprets that to mean at least 2 motorists. Like if 2 motorists are going the speed limit and everybody else is driving like, the Indy 500, then that's fine. No, it's not. That's not what that rule means, right? So a bare plural in a rule-based statement is going to strongly imply that we are talking about the entire category of states, or at least the entire category of states that have nuclear arsenals in this particular case. And we'll try to drop a link on bare plurals in the notes if you haven't seen that before. Now, it's a little counterintuitive for the affirmative to want to make this argument. The affirmative usually wants to reserve discretion to not have to affirm the entire resolution, to not have to look at nouns categorically. And certainly there will be affirmatives who do that here. An India-Pakistan affirmative is definitely a possibility here, right? A US-Russia affirmative is definitely a possibility here. But for those that go the other direction and say, nope, we're just using the judge's magical power on the app, the power of fiat, to get rid of all nuclear weapons, because that eliminates the need for deterrence. That's a very strategic approach that you're going to see, and the AF can make use of the fact that states is a bare plural and say that you interpret bare plurals to mean all, right? Now, if they don't, negative, you can use this argument too. If an affirmative tries to run an India versus Pakistan, they get rid of their nuclear weapons AF and nobody else, your argument could be no, states is a bare plural. It refers to the entire category of states. Their case is too limited. It doesn't meet the burden of the resolution. It's not sufficient to be topical. Therefore, I win, right? They lose because their case is too narrow. So it can cut either way, but you do need to be, aware of it. Now, if you're on the negative and you get hit with this, and somebody says, yeah, states refers to all states, we're getting rid of all nuclear weapons forever and ever, and deterrence therefore doesn't matter, what do? Well, I don't think you push back on the idea of a bare plural. I think you say, yeah, it's a bare plural. It's a normative statement that applies to all states, but I, as the negative, still have the right to point out that in the real world, normative statements get ignored all the time, right? The US and China violate international law all the time. They use drones to blow up civilians. They claim territory in the South China Sea that doesn't belong to them. There are numerous normative statements like you should get rid of your nuclear weapons, you should follow international law, that get ignored. Therefore, as the negative, my ground includes the right to say that there will be people who ignore this. Even if you establish a generic moral obligation for everybody, some people will still ignore it. The North Koreas, maybe the Russias, they're going to ignore it, right? And you might even say the United States. We've been the aggressor around the world too, right? People will ignore this, and you have to address what the world looks like then, right? And it will be a world that's less symmetrical, with a few actors having nuclear weapons as opposed to many actors having nuclear weapons. And then you can have access to the evidence that we'll see later that says that's a more dangerous world where nuclear war is more likely, right? And you can even run a little bit of light theory on this, right? You can say to prefer this interpretation for 2 reasons if you're the negative. Number one, this is the real world argument that exists, right? In the real world, what we debate about is eliminating nuclear weapons, but realizing that there will still be some residual risk from countries that don't go along with it. That's what's really being discussed in the literature, so this is more educational. And number 2, it's more fair, because if you allow the affirmative to say all nuclear weapons magically disappear forever, well, that takes away a huge part of the negative's ground and makes it less fair. So if I'm the neg, I'm going to fight back and basically say, sure, it's a general moral principle, but we have to anticipate that bad actors will ignore it. This is the only educational fair way to interpret the round. So that is states. There's a lot packed in there, I hope you can see. Ought. So with ought, Webster says we have three choices: moral obligation or advisability are the first two, and then there is natural expectation. Natural expectation just means like we expect this probably will happen, like he ought to be here in a few minutes, right? So you occasionally see people trying to get a little cheeky, a little squirrely, and use the natural expectation definition to try to convert a resolution into like a prediction, like states probably will eliminate their nuclear weapons. Now we all know that's not likely to happen. Borderline abusive, so be aware of that. I don't see a lot of people running that. The other big issue on ought, as we're going to talk about later on the negative, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it now, is the idea that ought implies can. This comes from Immanuel Kant and many other people, but the idea that you shouldn't do something unless it's possible to do. Well, of course, it's literally possible to get rid of your nuclear arsenal, but there's a larger question, as we just talked about a second ago, about whether it is actually feasible to have a long-term, enforceable, reliable regime that prevents nuclear weapons from popping back up. And if you can't, the neg would argue, we can't say that we ought to get rid of them if we can't actually feasibly, practically access a world where they stay gone. This is kind of goes to the idea of ought. I don't know that I would spend a lot of time in the definitions. It's more like a substantive argument, but just be aware that the idea of ought implies can, and the difficulty or impossibility of actually making a nuclear-free world work is negative territory and is potentially viable, right? Eliminate, according to Webster, means to put an end to or get rid of. There's also a potential definition that says remove from consideration. This is another sort of squirrely thing. I've seen some people suggest that you could sort of say remove from consideration means we should like take nuclear weapons away as like an option, like not consider them as an option, but we don't have to dismantle them. First of all, I don't know like what value this would have for anybody. Secondly, that's not what the remove from consideration definition means. When Webster uses that alternate definition of remove from consideration, they mean like if you have 5 candidates for a job and you're picking the top 2 for interviews, you eliminate the other 3. It's like taking options off the table. And here, what you're eliminating is not candidates. What you're eliminating is not options, it is arsenals. And an arsenal is a physical object, as we'll talk about in just a second. So I don't think that works there. I think if we said eliminate nuclear strikes, maybe so, but eliminate nuclear arsenals implies getting rid of a physical object. Also note that eliminate does not require permanence, right? So there's nothing in the definition of eliminate that guarantees that these things are going to go away forever. So definitionally speaking, you know, I don't think the affirmative can claim any sort of guarantee, at least without some kind of specific plan, right, that these things will disappear forever. You can eliminate the pests in your house and they come back. You can eliminate nuclear weapons and then go back to them when you find yourself in conflict, right? And then lastly, nuclear arsenals. I think just a few things to remember here. First of all, nuclear arsenals are the actual material things that we use to deliver a nuclear strike. They're not just the warheads and the bombs themselves, also things like ICBMs, nuclear silos, nuclear submarines, and many, many other billions and billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that would have to effectively be dismantled. So, it's certainly something that's doable, but it's worth noting that. Also, just remember to note as a talking point for the negative, eliminating an arsenal is not eliminating nuclear weapons forever. The technology to build nuclear weapons exists. It's in the hands of many, many more states than actually have built nuclear weapons. It is well known. You can look it up on the internet. Terrorist groups can find it. It is never going to disappear. So one thing the negative is going to want to point out is that by using the term nuclear arsenals, the resolution just reinforces the idea we can never get rid of nuclear technology or the knowledge of how to build a nuclear weapon, right? So that's important. And then lastly, on nuclear arsenals, remember that part of our arsenal is not just like city-destroying ICBMs. You also have things like low-yield, tactical, or non-strategic nuclear weapons, and we will talk a little bit about that when we get into the substantive arguments later. It could potentially be a little bit of a squirrel case for the negative if they wanted to say these things aren't so bad, they're not so harmful, they're really more like big, standard weapons, conventional weapons. So just be aware of that. But those are the definitional issues, and with that, we will now jump into values and criteria. Okay, so on the values and criteria, if you know me and if you've watched the channel for a while, you know that I'm not really big on getting super creative or esoteric when it comes to values. I think that values in LD are supposed to be the thing that you link up to and you say, this is our ultimate standard for what is good, like in the world and in the universe. And there are only a few things where I think everybody can agree that these are probably ultimately worthwhile things. And morality and justice are the two that come up a lot, right? And I think that on this resolution, morality is probably going to be your best bet, just general notions of right and wrong. Now, you can do a consequentialist utilitarian version of morality. You can do a Kantian deontological, this is right because it's universalizable version of it. But I think morality is just the simplest thing. I'm not big on getting super esoteric with them, and I think you can use it on both sides. Now, another option would potentially be like using human life, right? Especially if you're going to run maybe an extinction scenario on the AF or maybe on the neg, like deterring extinction through mutually assured destruction, I guess. But you could certainly use life, with the idea being that life is a prerequisite to all conceptions of justice, morality, and fairness. There's good literature out there. We may once again link to the very excellent, I think, Victory Briefs guide that they do on values and criteria that they have out there on the internet. You can get some information on all these. But I wouldn't venture too much farther than that. I wouldn't, for example, have national security as my value, not because national security is not important, not because you shouldn't have it in your case, but because you can legitimately ask, why is national security the most important thing, right? And you can't really do that with morality. You can do it with anything. I mean, this is debate, it's philosophy, right? But it's much harder to say, like, why is morality important? But on the other hand, you can say, like, national security, why does that matter? You know, for example, a bad state like Nazi Germany, we shouldn't want them to have national security. We should want them to be nationally insecure, so it's not an absolute value. You get the idea. With values, morality is probably your best bet on this one. Now, in terms of criteria, I think you have like a lot of really good options. On the AF, the first big one, I think, is going to be some form of rule utilitarianism. You know, utilitarianism, greatest good for the greatest number, greatest overall good for humanity. There are a lot of different formulations of it. I think the one you're going to want to look to on this particular resolution is probably going to be rule utilitarianism, right? Rule utilitarianism, as opposed to act utilitarianism, asks not like, what do we do in each individual case? Like, we don't run the utilitarian calculus every time we make a decision whether to have nuclear weapons. Instead, what you'd say is, we need to do a utilitarian calculus for what the best rule for the whole world would be, right? And you can justify why it has to be a rule for the entire world through, you know, various evidence and cards that we'll try to talk about later. But I think this is good, and this is where you're going to run a lot of your standard evidence about just the mass death and destruction, maybe extinction, maybe cost of these weapons, environmental impact of mining uranium, all those things. And I think that this is going to be sort of the most standard thing that you see, and it's absolutely, you know, absolutely acceptable for the AF. Another option on the AF would be, for example, a criteria of just war theory. Now, this is an option because it allows you to sort of hedge your bets between like utilitarian scenarios where you look at the impacts and the deaths, but also a deontological approach. Deontological just being like absolute ideas of right and wrong. So just war theory takes a deontological position that says there are just bad things that you should not do in war, and here's how you figure out what they are. And it specifically has a component called jus in bello, which is justice and fairness in fighting of wars. And jus in bello has two components that we're going to talk about later on the negative, called distinction and proportionality. Distinction is the idea that you have to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants and not attack the latter. And proportionality, which means if you do affect non-combatants, it has to be proportional to some military goal. In other words, your primary goal has to be some strategic military thing. You can't just be randomly killing civilians. And the basic argument is nuclear weapons are basically designed to indiscriminately kill as many people as possible. So they inherently, by their nature, can never satisfy just war theory because they are designed not to distinguish and not to be proportional. But then again, that's a deontological right is right and wrong is wrong position with a lot of great literature. But you also get to use pretty much all of your utilitarian evidence about the number of deaths, environmental devastation, nuclear winter, cancer, infrastructure destruction to prove that they're disproportional and that they don't draw distinctions, right? So you get to have a nice deontological this is right and this is wrong approach, but you also get to use all the good utilitarian evidence. So I think it's a really good option for the affirmative. Now, on the negative, you also have the option of using utilitarianism. And a utilitarian case on the negative would be about deterrence. It would say, look, in a world where we try to get rid of nuclear weapons, we're going to be getting rid of this force that has allowed us to maintain peace for 70 years since World War II between the great powers. We're going to be talking about mutually assured destruction, nuclear peace theory, the fact that nuclear weapons deter not only nuclear war, but also conventional war. right? And we're probably going to be talking about act utilitarianism here as opposed to rule utilitarianism, because we're going to say every country needs to make a rational decision for itself under the circumstances. I think utilitarianism is going to probably, just like on the app, be the most common negative, at least some form of it. So we're certainly going to talk about it later in the negative section. So also in the negative, I think Immanuel Kant and his categorical imperative, and also his notion that ought implies can, which is something that comes from Kant, is a good option, right? The basic idea with Kant's categorical imperative, as most of you know, is that for something to be moral, it has to be able to be made into a universal maxim. And your argument is the negative would be the resolution cannot be. The argument would basically be that the morality of possessing nuclear weapons depends on the circumstances and depends on the context. If you were to say, if you were the only country that had them and your intent was to go out and use them for conquest or for domination, well, of course that's unjust and immoral. But imagine a different scenario, like an alternate history where France is trying to deter Nazi domination of Europe and mass murder by Nazis, and they develop a few atomic weapons to make Nazi Germany think twice about invading them. Well, that very well could be defensible. And your argument would be, I don't have to prove that it's good in every case, but if I can identify some cases where it might be justifiable, where it might be the least bad option, then we can't make a categorical universal maxim of it, and therefore it's not just. And also, by the way, if you're using Kant, you might as well also use his idea that the notion that ought implies can. Kant is famous for this idea that to say we ought to do something, we have to be able to do it, right? And as we noted earlier, while it is literally possible to get rid of a nuclear arsenal, there's a lot of evidence out there that actually maintaining a stable regime of a nuclear-free world would be impossible, because somebody would inevitably break the deal, which would give other countries strong incentives to also break the deal and develop nuclear weapons, and we'd be back to square one with nuclear weapons, except we'd be a lot less stable because everybody would be scrambling to build them up like they did back in the 1950s. So the basic idea would be, this is a nice aspirational goal, but you can't make it work, so under Kant we cannot affirm, right? And then the last possible criterion for the negative would be just realism, like Hans Morgenthal's idea of realism. Hans Morgenthau has a lot of good ideas when it comes to international relations, but to make a long story short about Morgenthau, his basic contribution is to remind us that in the world of morality, interrelationships between nations are different than interrelationships between people within a nation state, because there's not one authority. There's not one like social contract to bind us all on one authority to make sure that right ends up winning. And it's a long and complex theory. It's probably too much to read in one debate round, but his fourth principle is just, in international relations, moral principles have to be filtered through the lens of the particular circumstances. And what we would say is, you can't say that an action is moral without looking at the consequences. So again, this is kind of like a utilitarian argument, just filtered through a different lens, right? And it's a good way to say, I don't like nuclear weapons generally, but we have to look at the particulars of every case rather than doing generic moral platitudes, right? We can't just have a world where the police say, we would like to have a world with no violence, therefore we are putting down our weapons. Well, the bad guys still have the weapons, and you have to look at the circumstances, particularly in international relations. So a lot of good options in terms of values and criteria, and with that we will move right into what you've all been waiting for, which is the affirmative. Okay, so on the affirmative, I want to start with the basic mechanics of how the resolution is going to be implemented, like how are we actually going to go about eliminating nuclear arsenals, and then move on, I think, to the basic sort of utilitarian case about eliminating nuclear weapons, saving lives, things like that you're going to see from a lot of debaters and that you very well may be using. And then move on from there to some other different options, some more esoteric things beyond just sort of basic utilitarianism. And so, yeah, I think that will be the order. So starting with the mechanics, I think there are sort of two basic options. One is to run a specific advocacy, a mechanism like a treaty, and we'll talk about that. And the other one is to look at it as sort of just a general moral proposition, right? And so let's look at both of those. So the first option is, let's just treat the resolution as a moral statement. In other words, I don't have to tell you as the judge, I as the affirmative don't have to tell you the specific way that we're going to get rid of nuclear weapons. This is just about whether there is a moral obligation to do it, right? This is a viable approach, I think. There are pros and cons to it, right? So treating it as a purely moral question where the affirmative does not have to address the how or the when or anything like that, just sign off on the morality of it. Number one, it gives you some flexibility, right? You're not attaching yourself to any particular like treaty or any particular plan, so you have some flexibility. And also there are some traditional LD judges out there who really like this. They think this is just how LD is supposed to work, and they appreciate this approach. But on the downside, the cons are, you do on some circuits and in some places has run into a fair number of debaters who are going to have arguments ready that you have to specify how this is going to be done. You have to give some particular plan or some kind of proposal that they can respond to. So if you see a lot of those, you might want to take that into consideration. And then in addition to that, what we're going to see in just a second is that certain plans may actually help give credibility to certain benefits that you want as part of your advocacy. In particular, some of these plans that we talk about, some common real-world proposals, are going to have regimes in place to help you prevent nuclear weapons from returning. In other words, to ensure and to inspect and to make certain that countries are living up to their obligations in the future. And that's one potential benefit. So the downside would be you wouldn't have that if you treated it as a purely moral question. Now, on the other side of things, if you want to run it as just sort of a straightforward plan or proposal, there are at least two good real-world options that I think you're going to see. The first one is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the TPNW of 2017. And what this is it is an as yet not effective UN treaty. It has been signed by 34 countries. It requires 50 countries to go into effect, and of course, it will only bind the countries that sign it, right? But basically what it is a simple, straightforward pledge to not possess nuclear weapons of any kind. If you have them, you have to get rid of them. If you don't have them, you can't acquire them. And it will implement a regime to go in and conduct inspections to ensure that you don't have them, that you don't, continue to pursue them. I think it is a very clean-cut, simple advocacy that you can use for many judges. The AF is basically going to say we are advocating for every country in the world to ratify the TPNW, and then to just follow it from then on, right? I think it's good. It's clean-cut. If you are going for, as we talked about earlier, the all nukes go away forever approach, right? Well, this is a good one, right? This gives that an air of legitimacy. It's not just my imagination, Judge. I'm not just some kid making this up. 34 countries have already signed on. We just want all the rest of the countries to do the same thing. Another good thing about TPNW is it's not too specific, right? It has frameworks in place for how we're going to have verification and inspection regimes in the future, but it doesn't have like highly specific mechanisms in place or highly specific dates. It leaves it to the parties to negotiate those so you don't get tied down to anything that's too specific. I think you're going to see a lot of people running TPNW. If you really want to be hardcore on the negative, you might download a copy of it and read it and start poking some specific holes in it, because I think it's going to be that common. I think you're going to see a lot of affirmatives running it. The other option from a real-world perspective would be Global Zero. Global Zero is an advocacy group comprised of current and former world leaders. That includes, for example, like U.S. senators and other folks. And what they have is basically a 25-year phase-out plan. So if we started now, it would be done in 2045. And the idea is to just basically gradually reduce your nuclear weapons until you decommission all of them, and then submit to a regime of frequent inspections of civilian nuclear sites, former weapons sites, just to make sure that you don't keep them. It's also a good option if you want something with a little bit more of a concrete time frame, but you still don't want to get nailed down to anything too particular. So a good option if you don't want to do TPNW. Now, another possibility that some people have thrown out is the idea that you can affirm by just meeting existing international law obligations, right? An international law AF. In other words, you just have to follow the rules that are already in place. You don't need a new agreement like the TPNW. And I believe, as somebody who's a lawyer by trade, that this is just wrong. They cite a couple of sources of international law. The first one is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, of 1970. This is kind of the great granddaddy of nuclear treaties. It has 191 signatories, including the US, UK, France, Russia, and China. Notable non-signatories are nuclear powers like India, Israel, and Pakistan. And it's all about not letting your nuclear weapons proliferate. And that's really important, but that's not what the resolution is about. But some folks are suggesting that this treaty creates an international law duty to disarm, to get rid of nuclear weapons, and it just does not. If you look at Article 6 of the treaty, what it says is there's an obligation to negotiate in good faith on disarmament, to try to reach toward disarmament with other nuclear states, but it never says you have an obligation to do it. And you know what? If states and nations believed that the NPT of 1970 had this obligation, why would they have drafted the TPNW in 2017? It would be totally superfluous. If the 1970 treaty did it, you wouldn't need a new one in 2017. So the NPT is not an obligation to disarm. Nobody thinks it is in the actual world of international relations. It might suggest you should look toward that in the future, but it doesn't already require it as a matter of international law. The second international law source that some folks cite is the 1996 International Court of Justice opinion, saying that the use of nuclear weapons is illegal under international law. And it is a little bit more in point. It does say that according to the ICJ, they believe that the use of nuclear weapons is illegal under principles of international law. But but it also doesn't create a pre-existing duty for two reasons. First is, right there in the opinion, it explicitly says it's an advisory opinion. In other words, there was not a case where like a country used a nuclear weapon in the 90s and got hauled before the ICJ. They just asked them to sort of state their opinion. And one basic principle of legal interpretation is that advisory opinions where there's not an actual case or controversy, right, aren't binding, right? No one believes that this opinion is binding. It was basically the court saying, hey, if this ever came up, this is what we might think. But it's not a binding opinion in an actual case. But more importantly, right there in the opinion itself, in paragraph 97 on page 263, it specifically says that the court cannot conclude that the use of nuclear weapons would be illegal in a case, an extreme case like where the survival of a state is at stake. Well, guess what? Nuclear weapons are used overwhelmingly when the survival of a state is at stake. That's like when they're used. So I don't think either one of these creates an existing duty. So I kind of just wanted to take a second and warn folks, an international law case, in my view, is very weak. Now, you can certainly advocate for the creation of new international law like the TPNW, but the idea that there's an existing requirement is not a strong way to frame the app. So now let's move on and let's talk about kind of the basic utilitarian case here. So when we talk about the basic utilitarian case that the affirmative is going to run, remember just the core of what we're saying here. We're saying that a world where nuclear weapons don't exist is going to dramatically reduce the death of human extinction. It's going to dramatically reduce the risk of huge numbers of death and suffering. And there are other things, for example, like cost, environmental issues with like mining, that we can also throw in there. Remember that we're going to be comparing all of these things, right? All of the dangers we're going to be talking about and all the risks we're going to be talking about of death, we're going to be comparing them to a world where there's none of that, where there's zero, right? The number is zero. Because what we're going to be saying is the app is we're getting rid verifiably through the TPNW or whatever, right? Whatever means, of all state-owned nuclear weapons, right? So there's going to be no need to continue to have them. There's going to be no risk of nuclear war. The first thing you need to look at on a utilitarian analysis is the probability that nuclear war will actually occur and what the expected losses would be. And I think the best way to do this, rather than just reading cards where people kind of philosophize about it in prose, right, is to look at actual numbers. And luckily there are some good sources. So for example, Sandberg and Bostrom, and yes, by the way, this is the same Bostrom who predicts that we live in a computer simulation and the world's going to end. He gets cited in LD sometimes. But back in 2008, Sandberg and Bostrom polled experts at the Global Catastrophic Risk Conference. And these are folks who are some of the brightest minds in the world on things like nuclear war, on things like climate change and other massive disastrous occurrences, right? And what they said, the consensus of these smart folks, was that there's a 30% chance of 1 million deaths due to nuclear war by the year 2100. There's a 10% chance of 1 billion deaths, and there's a 1% chance of human extinction due to nuclear war by the year 2100. Now, to be fair, take this with a grain of salt. These same folks did predict that the chance of us being killed off by a super intelligent AI was 5%, so maybe they worry a lot. But this is a good number to start with. These are good concrete numbers. Now remember, you can magnify these things, right? If you talk about the chance of extinction, this is something that comes up a lot in policy debate. There is an idea that any significant risk of extinction is basically an infinite impact, right? And this, Jonathan Schnell, as a journalist, wrote about this in the New Yorker back in 1982, and what he basically said, and many people have said this, is that if you eliminate humanity as a whole, you not only lose the existing lives, but you lose all human lives that could have ever existed in the future. And the argument would be, because there is the potential for infinite human lives to exist, then whatever the percentage chance of that happening has to be multiplied by infinity. And this is sort of the infinite impact extinction scenario that people use. So be aware of that. You may choose to use it. Understand that some affirmatives and maybe even some negatives, depending on how they run their case, might try to use this. But turning back to sort of the empirics, even better than the Bostrom and Sandberg piece is a series of pieces by Luisa Rodriguez from the Effective Altruism Forum in 2019. It's much more recent. And she just does a fantastic job of doing kind of an informal meta-analysis of the risk of a US-Russia nuclear war, which of course would be the worst, occurrence that could happen, because that's where 90% of the nuclear weapons lie. And based on the calculations of many other people and many different methodologies, the consensus that Rodriguez came to was that each year there is a 1.1% 0% chance that nuclear war will happen as long as we continue to have them. And specifically, each year there's a 0.38% risk of nuclear war between the US and Russia. Now you say to yourself, that seems low. And in any given year, yes, that is low, right? But if you start multiplying it out by decades up to the year 2100 and beyond, it not only becomes likely, it becomes virtually certain at some point, right? She also has a fantastic article about what the casualties would look like in a US-Russia nuclear war. Again, she does a meta-analysis. She does a fantastic job of explaining that the deaths would come not primarily from the blasts themselves, but from the environmental degradation, like blasting soot and dirt up into the atmosphere that would result in massive rapid climate change. This is what is called nuclear winter, right? The fallout would result in cancer being epidemic. Infrastructure would be destroyed. Agriculture would be destroyed. Medicine would be destroyed. And most of the people that would die protracted deaths from things like starvation and just succumbing to regular injuries that couldn't be treated. In terms of the numbers, the consensus of the sources she looks at is that there would be 5.5 billion expected deaths, right, with a 90% confidence interval that it would be between 2.7 and 7.5, with 7.5 being basically getting close to extinction, right? She even points out that these deaths would not be instantaneous in a blast, right, but rather excruciating and prolonged, right, due to things like starvation. Now, we know what the other side of this argument is going to be, don't we? We know that the negative is going to say, no, nuclear arms deter aggression. They actually make it less likely that we see war, not only nuclear war, but conventional war. And we're going to talk about that on the negative. What you need to be able to do to run a utilitarian affirmative, right, is to be able to respond to that. And luckily, there is some good empirical evidence on that too. And I'm going to refer you to two sources that we will have in the notes, Geller 1990 and Rauschhaus of 2009, right? And basically what the two of them say is this. Geller says that contrary to popular belief, nuclear weapons don't make nuclear powers less likely to be aggressive. They actually make them more likely to escalate conflicts between them up to the point of nuclear war. And they do stop short of nuclear war. So yes, arguably, I guess nuclear weapons deter nuclear war, right? But then the argument would be, well, why don't we just get rid of them if that's all they deter, right? And then Rauschhaus has what is kind of a common sense point. He's from 2009. He's more modern, right? About how nuclear weapons make nuclear states versus non-nuclear states more likely to bully. In other words, if you're a state with nuclear weapons, you're more likely to be aggressive and be a bully toward non-nuclear states. And we can see anecdotal evidence of that, like the United States military adventures all over the world, Iraq and Afghanistan and places like that. At least on a gut level, it seems to sort of ring true, right? And so if you have these two scholars, and the basic consensus is nuclear weapons make us more aggressive toward non-nuclear powers, which is, remember, 180 countries in the world, and they don't stop us from being aggressive toward nuclear powers, except when it comes to nuclear war. What that means is the only thing nuclear weapons deter is the use of nuclear weapons themselves. And even then, there is some non-zero risk, right? Even if they're so far, for the first 70 years we've had them, which historically is not all that long a time, right? They've been pretty good at keeping us from using them. That's all they deter. They don't deter aggression in any other area, according to these studies. That would be the argument for the AF, right? So why don't we just get rid of them and reduce whatever residual risk there is from like an accidental launch or a poorly decided launch down to zero? That would be the affirmative argument, right? Now, in addition to that core affirmative utilitarian argument, there are some other sort of utilitarian arguments that you can kind of throw in the mix, and let me just go through them briefly. So the first one is even small wars kill billions, and this is from International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War in 2013, and what it says is that you don't have to have a massive all-out nuclear war to see a huge number of deaths, right? What they say is that even a limited exchange of just 100 nukes, remember we have 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world, but even 100 of them between the United States and Russia could plunge the world into a massive nuclear winter, a famine that would reduce global crop supplies, which would lead to potentially the death of up to 2 billion people. So it would be a famine affecting 2 billion people, in addition to the hundreds of millions of deaths that would occur. So that's a nice point to have, so you don't have to necessarily resort to like extinction level type stuff. The next argument would be financial cost. This is from the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons in 2011. That's the most current evidence websites I could find on this, but it says that nuclear powers spend over $100 billion a year on their nuclear arsenals. This is not as big an impact as deaths, right? But the benefit of it is 100% certain. It's not like a contingent future risk. It's an amount of money that actually gets spent year after year after year after year. So if you wanted to sort of pile that on top of a utilitarian analysis about how much these weapons cost, that's a possibility. The third utilitarian argument is non-proliferation. And this actually comes from that Carnegie debate compendium that I talked about at the beginning from Perkovich and Acton. And what they basically talk about is how non-proliferation is not viable as a long-term goal unless we engage in nuclear disarmament. Basically, non-proliferation being the prevention of nuclear weapons spreading both to state actors and non-state actors and making the world more dangerous. And what they basically say in so many words is that non-nuclear powers are not going to continue following these aggressive non-proliferation protocols forever unless they see that nuclear powers are getting serious about disarmament. And then the second thing they say is in a world where we do disarmament, we would have to have much more aggressive, better funded monitoring regimes to make sure nuclear power, like civilian nuclear power, wasn't getting in the wrong hands, and that would make it much easier to ensure non-proliferation happened and that we didn't have folks getting loose nuclear weapons out there. So it's a good potential argument. And then the last option would be uranium mining and it's effect on indigenous populations. And unfortunately, this one has not worked out as well as I think some folks have predicted. On a gut level, it's great. Well, it's tragic, but it's great because a lot of uranium mining, not just in the United States, but in Canada and Australia, takes place on native and indigenous lands and has terrible health consequences for these folks. So as tragic as that is, right, it could make for a very good affirmative argument. The problem, though, is solvency, right? Because the vast majority of uranium that we mine is not used in nuclear weapons, but rather in civilian power production. There's a big difference between the highly enriched uranium that we use for nuclear weapons and the uranium that we use for just everyday power production. The world mines about 52,000 tons of uranium each year. Meanwhile, the entire global stockpile of nuclear weapons only uses about 1,500 tons, right? So orders of magnitude more uranium is being mined. So it's really hard to argue that getting rid of nuclear weapons would solve for stopping uranium mining. You'd have to get rid of the civilian nuclear industry, and it really doesn't do that. Okay, and just winding it up on the app, there are a few more potential arguments that I think merit mention, even though they don't fit neatly within kind of a utilitarian framework. The first one is just war theory. We talked about this earlier. This comes from both classical philosophers like St. Thomas Aquinas, but also more modern folks like Michael Walzer, who in 1977 had a really great piece called Just and Unjust Wars, in which he applies a form of just war theory to nuclear weapons specifically and to other things as well. It's a fantastic piece. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a version of it online that's not behind a paywall. So I'll keep looking, and I will try to put some block quotes in the slides if I can't do anything else on that. But just remember, just war theory has the two components: just ad bellum, which is about going to war, and just in bello, which is just behavior in war. And just in bello has several subcomponents, including distinction and proportionality. You have to draw distinctions between combatants and non-combatants. You have to be proportional. You can't engage in attacks that kill huge numbers of civilians for no good military reason. There has to be proportionality in the number of civilian casualties you have. And the idea is that nuclear weapons simply can never meet that because they are designed to indiscriminately kill large numbers of civilians and to inflict mass attrition on your opponent, right? And as a consequence, they just never will, even possessing them will never meet just war theory. And I think the really good thing about just war theory, as I said earlier, it lets you use all of the sort of statistics and the deaths and things like that, but it also lets you use quotes like, for example, Michael Walzer pointing out that nuclear deterrence, like nuclear standoffs, depend on a country making a commitment to engage in indiscriminate mass murder, right? That's what you're doing when you say nuclear deterrence. And having sort of good gut level common sense quotes like that from some of these just war folks is a really nifty angle, I think. So that's a good option. The second thing you're going to see a lot of, I think, is India and Pakistan. I do think you'll see affirmatives saying that what we're talking about here is having two countries get rid of their nuclear weapons, India and Pakistan. Now, to do this, remember, you have to win the idea that states can refer to just two states as opposed to like all states. And we talked earlier, bare plurals, about the barriers to that. But if you win that, if you are able to carry that through in the debate, I do think that India and Pakistan are strategically good options for the app. First of all, they've got really big impacts, right? Not as big as the US and Russia, but there's a 2019 article by Toon and Bardeen and others estimating that a nuclear war between India and Pakistan would result in 125 million casualties. So you get massive impacts just by having the two of them disarm. But it also allows you to sidestep a lot of the global security downsides of disarmament. If the United States were to disarm, you could really make a lot of counterpoints as the negative about, well, who's going to effectively deter North Korea? Who's going to effectively deter Russia? But India and Pakistan don't really do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to global deterrence. They're really mainly just deterring each other. And so if they deter, there's a lot less downside, right, in terms of global loss of global security than if the United States or someone else did. So it lets you get a lot of the benefits of preventing a massive war between two heavily populated countries without a lot of the downside of the loss of global security from having a nuclear power there. Last point I'll make on the app is critical security studies. Now, cards on the table, I unfortunately don't think that there's a super strong critical angle on this. I tried to find some. I tried to find some with uranium mining and stuff like that. Critical security studies, though, is a field of international relations that applies critical theory, like critical gender theory, critical race theory, to ideas of international relations. And it basically says they look very much to sort of a masculine, top-down, statist approach to these things without considering the lived experiences of various groups and intersectionality and that kind of stuff. As an academic field, to me, it is interesting. There's a lot of stuff in some of these articles that was interesting, but I just did not find a particular piece or source where you saw a scholar reach a specific different result on the question of nuclear weapons. I didn't, for example, see anybody say, yes, it would be worth having, 100 million deaths if that meant we had to rethink how we approach security and have more intersectional voices represented. I doubt you'll see that. Basically, at the end of the day, a lot of them didn't seem to disagree with the idea that preventing deaths is good. So, other than kind of doing the razzle-dazzle where you use sources that are a little esoteric and use some of the critical studies jargon, I just don't know how much independent work the critical theory does on this. But I am going to link to what I thought was a very interesting article, Power, Violence, and Nuclear Weapons by Professor Ann Harrington in 2016. Where you can get sort of a flavor for how critical security studies work. And if it interests you, maybe you can run a case like that. I just didn't see anything that I was crazy about. So with that, that is the AF. Now let's move on and look to the negative. So on the negative, I think it's important to take a second at the outset and talk a little bit about what the basic core theory on the neg will be, because it's a little bit less intuitive than the AF. The AF is very much about, hey, we've got these dangerous weapons. If we could just get rid of them, the world would be a safer place and it would be a more just place, and that's good, right? But on the negative, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And I think if you're smart on the negative, you'll take a little bit of a strategic position and say, basically, look, we all agree that avoiding nuclear annihilation is an extremely important goal. We might even agree that it is the most important goal in the round. But the question is not whether nuclear annihilation is bad. The question is, in the real world, as a practical matter, how do we achieve the goal of preventing it, right? The thing is, nuclear weapons and the knowledge of how to make them exist, and they will always exist. They cannot be uninvented. That's a phrase the neg should repeat. They cannot be uninvented. You can never put the nuclear genie back in the bottle. But the good news is nuclear weapons haven't been used since 1945. They haven't been used since the second country had them. As long as there has been a balance of nuclear power, nobody has wanted to use them. Nobody has used them because the stakes are too high. And beyond that, nuclear weapons have also prevented conventional wars using bombs and tanks and planes and soldiers between the major nuclear powers, right? Not India and Pakistan, not conflict there, but between the major powers, the United States, Russia, China, the UK, they have prevented wars for about 70 years, right? Eliminating nuclear arsenals will put us back in a world where these major power wars, right, these conventional wars are possible. And they will also lead to a world in which rogue states will ignore the resolution, they won't follow the resolution, and countries like North Korea, Iran, Israel, even non-state actors like ISIS can very quickly put together nuclear weapons and become the most powerful military actors in the world, and that's a bad world to live in. And even if everyone did follow the resolution for a time, right, right? As soon as there's a major world conflict, the idea that nation states are not going to turn and develop nuclear weapons to try to ensure their survival is just laughable. Of course they will. And that will lead us to a world where we're back to square one, only it's less stable and it's less secure, right? We've gotten into the wars to begin with, right? And in the long run, that's bad. And we as the negative agree that there are things that we can do. We can lower our level of aggression. We can lower our level of nuclear readiness. We can reduce the number of nuclear weapons. There are many good options that don't do away with the fundamental protection that nuclear deterrence gives us, right? This is an argument about what happens in the real world. We have to be grown-ups, and we have to understand we can't unring the bell. We can't uninvent nuclear weapons. So with that general story in mind, how do we carry it out in terms of specific negative cases? So the first option would be what I would call like a nuclear peace theory case. This is a basic deterrence case that the negative could run. The first thing you have to do in a case like this is just explain to the judge how deterrence works. And there are several ways to do it. In terms of a common sense explanation that people can understand, some really good explanations come from something called game theory. Game theory is an academic field that attempts to predict behavior between competing groups, whether in business or war or whatever, by treating it like a game that has moves and trying to predict what a rational person or a rational actor would do. And this is something that has been applied to nuclear deterrence for a long time. And the basic idea is if you view war as a game where A is doing, like group A, country A is doing a rational cost-benefit analysis of its moves and trying to maximize its benefits, then if B possesses nuclear weapons, the potential cost of even playing the game of war goes up so high that neither side even wants to play. And if you want a really good explanation of this, Morton Kaplan, way back in 1958, did a fantastic article on game theory and nuclear war that we'll link to. And it has a ton of mathematical stuff and formulas that you're not going to be able to use, but it just concludes, look, the certainty of destructiveness of nuclear weapons therefore immediately outlaws the attempt to accomplish major goals by military war. Thus, with respect to all important areas of the world, the willingness to use nuclear weapons outlaws military conflict. And so the second way we would do this, and the way we would explain it to judges, would be to look at history. And history has borne Kaplan's prediction out, right? There has not been a great power war since the development of nuclear weapons in the 1940s. That's just a fact. We've had proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam and wars in other places, but never a true great power war. We've had the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've had things where we got close, the affirmative will point out, but we've never had these wars. And what that means in terms of an impact is less death and less suffering. As Michael Schellenberger pointed out in 2018, the number of deaths in battle around the world has declined 95% in the 70 years since nuclear weapons were introduced, right? And he actually links to a really good site by Max Roser that just breaks down war casualties. And if you want to do a deep dive and just talk about how much war casualties and violence have fallen off since the invention of nuclear weapons, we'll link to that and you can read it. It's actually a good site for like any topic that deals with war or conflict or international relations in those areas. But in addition to just pure history, like the historical fact, because obviously the app is going to push back on there being other causes, there is scholarly analysis that suggests that yes, in fact, deterrence does work. It does reduce conflict. One of the most famous one is from Bueno de Mesquita and Riker. These are two scholars. It's from way back in 1982, but it's a really good empirical analysis that points out empirically the closer the proximity of nuclear weapons to a conflict, like either the parties themselves have it or they have close allies who have nuclear weapons, right? The less likely the conflict is to escalate. And they also make an argument that like miscalculation, like one thing the affirmative could say and point out is that there are situations where a miscalculation, like misreading something on your radar, thinking it's a nuclear weapon, could result in nuclear war. But they actually argue that miscalculation is less likely when at least one party has nuclear weapons because countries are more risk averse. They don't want to make a mistake and they're less likely to go to war based on a mistake. Now, more recently, there's a piece from Suzuki 2015, and this one actually uses machine learning to investigate whether having more nuclear states in the world would lead to more conflict or less. And good news for the neg here as well. I'll just read the conclusion. The main findings reveal that the optimist expectation of the relationship between nuclear proliferation and interstate conflict is empirically supported. First, a larger number of nuclear states on average decreases the systemic propensity for interstate conflict. And second, there is no clear evidence that the emergence of new nuclear states increases the systemic propensity for interstate conflict. So basically what Suzuki is saying is that if more states have nuclear weapons, the less dangerous the world is because everybody knows that going to war war is not worth it, right? So there are multiple ways in which you can explain deterrence, either through just common sense or empirics. And then you also have multiple impact scenarios. The first one would be just like conventional wars become more likely. And you could say, look, even if the affirmative can show you that we get rid of all nuclear weapons, we're still going to have conventional weapons. And as the Financial Times says, I think this is from, I'm not sure what year it is, but the Financial Times has a good article with a lot of good language on this. It just says, a world that is genuinely free of nuclear weapons would look very different. War between big powers would once again become thinkable. In previous eras, the rise and fall of great powers has almost always been accompanied by war. The main reason for hoping that the rise of China will be an exception to this grisly rule is that both the US and China have nuclear weapons. They will have to find other ways to act out their rivalry. We take away nuclear weapons and we return to the era of World War I, World War II, previously the Napoleonic Wars, things like that, where these massive wars become a realistic thing because mutually assured destruction no longer occurs, right? The second thing the article points out is that it's very easy to rebuild nuclear weapons once we start these conflicts, right? A world without nuclear weapons might also be one of much deeper mutual suspicion. Even if states did scrap all their nukes, most would retain the knowledge and the ability to build a nuclear weapon quickly, right? And he points out that this rebuilding could happen very quickly and lead to escalation of conventional wars into nuclear wars. There are many other impact scenarios. You could have rogue states that secretly hold on to nuclear weapons or openly hold on to nuclear weapons like North Korea very likely would. You could have situations where states replace their nuclear weapons with expensive conventional weapons spending, building up their conventional forces and getting ready to go to war, and the cost associated with that. You could have some cases, some arguments I've heard of like replacing nuclear weapons with bioweapons, which arguably have an even greater propensity or possibility of leading to extinction. So there's a lot of scenarios, a lot of potential impact scenarios here that you can link to. Now, so that is the basic calculus. We don't have enough time to spend a huge amount of time on it, but that's the basic calculus of the deterrence argument. And I would just make sure you take some time, read the stuff we link to, read as much as you can and understand it, because even if you're not running it, a large number of negatives will be, and there is empirical support for it. I think another option for the negative would be a counter plan that you could either use on its own or pair with something else that looks to what's called a no first use policy, combined with also a dramatic reduction in the number of weapons. Peter Zimmerman is a nuclear physicist and former chief scientist of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and he summed it up well by saying the planet would be safer with far fewer nuclear weapons, but more dangerous with none, right? We can't uninvent nuclear weapons. Aggressive states like North Korea and Russia will always have them. But if responsible states forsake them unilaterally, then the risk of war arguably goes up, as we just talked about. So instead of getting rid of them, what we need is a good compromise proposal. And what you would do here is you would run like a counter plan that says, number one, you commit to a no first use policy. And a no first use policy is something that China and India already follow, and it basically says we commit to never using nuclear weapons before they're used on us, right? We'll never use them against non-nuclear states. We'll never use them in a conventional war with a nuclear state unless we're hit with a nuclear weapon, right? And the idea is to lower the tension and lower the propensity for the other side to launch first, either accidentally or based on, a bad guess, right? Now, of course, you have to back this up, right? You have to show that you're committed to it. So, for example, what China does, and this is from Xinjiang Pan, I think is how you say it. I butchered that. I'm sorry. But it's Xinjiang Pan, I think, from 2017, has a good article just describing how China's no first use policy works. Basically, you take your nuclear weapons, what they do is they take their nuclear weapons and basically put them in bunkers that are designed to ride out the first strike in a nuclear war and then to be brought out and strike back as necessary. But they really can't be used first because they take so long to launch, right? Well, the United States and Russia could follow in those footsteps, right, and do the same thing. In addition to that, you could propose dramatically lowering the number of nuclear weapons from thousands, which is really overkill, it's more than you need, to maybe just a few hundred, which would certainly be more than enough to deter any rational country from striking first, but not enough maybe to destroy the entire world or lead to extinction. Now, the net benefit here would be we would dramatically lower the risk of a hastily considered war, but we would do it without giving countries like a North Korea or a Russia any incentive to become nuclear bullies or to become aggressors around the world, because they know there is still the capacity to destroy them and to make them pay for aggression, right? So I think this is a good option for the negative. Another option for the negative, and a little bit creative, but I like it as well, is an egalitarian or egalitarianism type case. This is a case that argues that nuclear weapons allowed the weak to fight back against the strong. That is why a twice invaded, weakened France after World War II pursued them to defend against a potential future threat from Germany. And Schellenberger in 2018 has some good information about this, so we'll link to that. But basically, the idea is they allow poorer, less affluent, less powerful countries to push back against the Germanys of the world in World War II, or maybe arguably today against imperialist designs by the United States. So this is one kind of unconventional, somewhat progressive approach that you can take, and Schellenberger talks about it. Another angle on egalitarianism, and this is even more kind of risky, but it's very intriguing, is that nuclear weapons force the rich and the powerful to internalize the cost of war just like everybody else. Like historically, the poor and marginalized in any given country are far more likely to have to go off and fight and die in a war. That's true in the United States today if you look at the composition of our military and their demographics. And it's true in virtually every country. But historically, wealthy folks could get out of it. Like there are many stories of wealthy landowners paying to have their sons be replaced by someone else in the Civil War. German industrialists got rich under the Third Reich, building Volkswagens and things like that. Nuclear war, as crass as this may seem, levels the playing field. Part of the reason it's such a good deterrent is because the rich and the poor die together. Like the song we had at the beginning, we'll all go together when we go, right? And there's a column by Charlie Reese back in 1995 in the Orlando Sentinel, and we will link to it. And I will admit, it's pretty tongue-in-cheek, but basically what it says is that, the war profiteers and the regular folks will all die in a nuclear war, which gives everybody, especially the powerful, incentives that they might not have under a conventional war. They're not going to get rich, they're going to die. And it's kind of an interesting progressive angle that I sort of like. Another possibility for the negative is the Immanuel Kant categorical imperative impossibility type case. You remember we talked about this earlier where we said the categorical imperative requires a universal maxim and that you can't do that. You have to look to the specific circumstances that states find themselves in, and you can't universalize that. You can absolutely envision cases where a country like, an alternate history France or an India versus Pakistan or Israel, for example, facing off against existential threats could feel justified, and perhaps you could argue be justified in having nuclear weapons, and you just have to do it on a case-by-case basis. The other thing we talked about is the ought implies can argument. And here what you would need is evidence that it's just not feasible to maintain a long-term regime in which we actually prevent countries from having nuclear weapons. Even if you manage to snap your fingers and fiat it through the affirmative, within a short period of time, that would fall apart. And there is evidence for that. Like Sinan Ulgen in 2014, writing in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, it writes this: second, how would a world without nuclear weapons be managed? If the world were essentially one big peace cartel, this cartel would be very fragile indeed. Economic theory indicates that members of a cartel become more likely to engage in cartel-busting behavior as the rewards for doing so increase and the penalties decrease. A similar logic would pertain where nuclear weapons are concerned. And basically what he goes on to argue is there would always be an incentive for any particular country that felt threatened or just wanted to be more powerful to go ahead and restart or rebuild or build for the first time nuclear weapons, and has empirical evidence of that. I think the impact on this is, as between two worlds where in both worlds you have nuclear weapons, but at least in the current status quo world, we know who has them. They're mostly in the hands of relatively stable countries. Obviously, North Korea is a big exception to that, but they're mostly in the hands of fairly responsible countries, right? If we're going to have nuclear weapons in either world, we ought to stick with the one that we have now rather than one where a bunch of every country gets rid of them and we just have randomly some country decides they want to be the most powerful nation in the world, and that sets off a string of events that could potentially lead to nuclear war, right? So that would be the impossibility argument. We just can't maintain it. It's not feasible, so let's not go down that road at all. And then the last argument I think the neg can consider is an argument about specific bad actors that exist in the real world preventing disarmament. So for example, we could look to Iran and Israel, and this comes from Perkovich and Acton in the Carnegie publication. It's on page 44. And what it says is global nuclear abolition cannot happen without the simultaneous or prior establishment of a verifiable WMD, weapons of mass destruction, free zone in the Middle East. Iran's refusal to comply with IAEA and Security Council obligations renders both objectives impossible. Israel's possession of nuclear weapons does too, but Iran, unlike Israel, blocks even the first steps toward creating such a zone by not recognizing Israel's right to exist. It is politically unrealistic to expect a state to relinquish its nuclear deterrent as long as its neighbors and declared adversaries do not recognize its existence or demonstrate the political will to live in peace with it. And so the argument here is you try to focus on some specific conflict. Take up for Pakistan, take up for Israel as opposed to Iran, and say there are certain states whose very existence would be threatened, who would be threatened with just all-out destruction, potentially some genocide, right, if they did not have some level of nuclear deterrent. And we cannot tell people to put down their arms in those cases because we do not yet have a guarantee. We do not have anything that can guarantee Israel that they won't be immediately annihilated by neighbors that surround them and vastly outgun them in terms of conventional military forces, right? So if you want to be a little bit more specific, a little bit narrower, that would be a good option to look at. So anyway, on the whole, as you can see, the negative looked a little bit more challenging at the beginning, and it probably is overall, but there's good evidence on both sides of the debate. I think it's going to be a well-matched and even debate. So with that, let's move on and do some really quick final thoughts. Final thoughts on this are going to be really brief. The video has gone on a long time already. There's obviously a ton of literature to read. All I can say is that the more you read and the more literate you become and the more conversant you become and the better able you are to explain your arguments in common sense, the better you will do. You guys have a lot of really big tournaments out there in front of you. I hope you do really well. If you have great conquests and victories, please drop them in the comments. We always love hearing about them. That's what this channel is for. We want to see you do well. We'll be back next month in the studio with all of our folks are ready to rock and roll. But until then, I will just say, as always, have fun, work hard, and hail safe.